Our speaker tonight is Rob Boston, a journalist and secular activist who joined Americans United for Separation of Church and State 35 years ago. From this vantage point, Rob has seen a lot, the evolution of America's leading secularist organizations, as well as the growth in number, size, and political power of religious right organizations. Rob has written 4 books. Rob has appeared regularly as a media spokesman for AU and Secular Americans, and now serves as the senior advisor to AU. Fun fact, and once after an appearance on Fox News, an irate viewer emailed him and accused him of wearing a bad toupee. He assures us that his hair is real, but probably does need a cut. Without further ado, it's my honor to introduce our speaker this evening, Rob Boston.
Now, tonight, I'm going to talk to you about Christian nationalism. I'm going to talk to you about some things we can do to respond to that. Having worked in this area for 35 years, I've seen the erosion. I've seen the lowering of the wall of separation between church and state. I've seen the rise of a distorted, twisted, and offensive definition of religious freedom being embraced by the courts. I've seen people losing their rights. But we can look ahead and ask ourselves, what sort of country do we really wish to have? And I think that is a question worth answering, because as bad as this period is, as frightening as it is, and as alarming as it is, it will pass and it will fall. And it will happen because it is not serving the America we are, and certainly will not serve the America we are becoming. The diversity of our country, the rise of the nuns, people stepping away from organized religion, the drop in number of Christians. That is a recipe for a vibrant, diverse society that in no way can be served effectively by a court embrace of Christian nationalism. So it will take some time, but this period will pass. And at that point, we must ask ourselves, what comes next? Well, I think the first thing we need to think about is that what we really need in this country is equality for all religious and non-religious beliefs. For a long time, there was this kind of understanding that, oh yes, we have these other religions, these non-Christian religions, but they're really kind of second class. And certainly the people who don't believe, and the doubters and the skeptics, as long as they keep their mouth shut, we'll put up with them. They can be tolerated. Well, no more. A proper understanding of separation of church and state is that all religions have the same rights and the same burdens. And what we have is a situation where if you wish to be Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, pagan, Wiccan, atheist, humanist, whatever, your rights as a citizen are exactly the same, no matter which of those groups you choose to affiliate with, or if you choose to affiliate with none. And the law must recognize that that is the case. And that's an area that is taking a little bit of time, but we're getting there. We also need to understand that religious organizations in the United States actually have a very good deal, a good set of privileges, if you think about it for a minute. They are tax exempt. They're often exempt from laws that secular organizations must follow. They do not have to do any serious financial reporting. If we form a nonprofit organization in this country, and it's a big enough nonprofit, you have to make certain reports publicly available about your finances. Well, houses of worship are exempt from all that. So there is a certain amount of privilege that is already extended to religious organizations. Now, we can certainly ask whether that should continue, whether that is a good thing. Some of that may be ripe for reform. But at the very least, we should expect religious organizations in this hypothetical new order that we hope to see to understand their privilege and to be thankful for it and stop complaining about being persecuted, because believe me, they are not being persecuted. They are, in fact, occupying a perch of privilege. The next thing I think many of us would like to see is an understanding that persuasion is fine, force is not. And what I mean by that is simply, if a person or a group decides that it wants to tell others about its religion, great, that's fine. They can do that with their own privately raised funds. They can even go into public spaces and distribute literature or talk to people. Nobody's going to try to shut that down. But what they need to understand is that if they have made their best argument, and that many of us are not persuaded, they have to accept that. The problem we're seeing right now is that too many Christian nationalist organizations are saying, well, we haven't managed to persuade you, so we're going to force you. And that's where we start to have conflict and tension with the application of force. And I would argue with these organizations that they may believe that what they have is wonderful, but if it were so wonderful, it would not need the application of force. So in this new order, a government that understands that this type of force or coercion simply has no place in matters of religion in public schools and in other public entities. Another thing I would like to see us move toward is an understanding that reason and science are the appropriate platforms for the government to rest its public policy upon, not religion. We saw an example of this recently and are still seeing it with the COVID pandemic. Remember, in the early days of the pandemic, how many religious organizations were resisting sensible rules designed to keep us all safe? Some of the early closure orders, they fought those because they still wanted to meet, they believed that the blood of Jesus was going to keep them healthy. Well, a number of people got sick, and unfortunately, some of them even died, but they endangered the rest of us too, because after they had their religious meetings, they went out into other spaces where people were and affected them. We've seen the dangers of people denying evolution. We've seen the dangers of people denying climate science on religious grounds. People have the right to deny those things if they want, but the government should not be basing policy on those denials. And unfortunately, and in many parts of the country, especially in the very red states, that's what we're seeing. Public policy driven not by science, not by reason, not sometimes by things we can even see with our own eyes and experience, but by religion. All laws should be based on secular rationales. Next thing we'd like to move forward, and we'll be moving toward in our new order, is a truly secular system of public education. Now, you might say, well, we have that now. Well, yes, it depends on where you live. You might have that. In many parts of the country, especially in Bible Belt states or even rural areas of blue states, we find repeated violations of the separation of church and state in public education. Schools hosting prayer events, creationism being taught in science class, books being banned, LGBTQ students being harassed, and a host of other things. And it's almost always conservative forms of Christianity that are being lifted up by these schools. Let me be clear, public schools are not anybody's mission field. They are designed to impart secular education to the masses. There are plenty of avenues for people who wish to preach and to proselytize in churches and other private arenas. That is not the goal of public education. The next thing we're working toward is that religion pays for all of its own stuff. Again, some people might say, aren't they doing that now? No, they're not actually. Voucher plans of private religious schools are now publicly funded. There are many other types of programs where religious entities take public money to provide social services. Now, some of the churches that do this will serve everybody and there's no problem, but others are aggressively proselytizing or turn away people because they're LGBTQ or they're not Christian, or you force them to, sit through a sermon first. Listen, this is going to be a real problem in this country because of the demographic trends I've talked about. We have a habit in this nation of turning our social services, food pantries, homeless shelters, job training programs, drug and alcohol abuse programs. We have a habit of turning those over to religious organizations, throwing some taxpayer money at it and saying, you deal with this. Well, if current trends continue, there aren't going to be enough houses of worship to deal with that anyway. We need another system. We need publicly funded, government provided secular services for those in need. Nobody who's hungry or doesn't have a home or is grappling with addiction should have to come begging to a house of worship for help. They should just be able to get the help from the state. And that's something we're going to be working on in the years to come. Lastly, we're going to need an understanding that religious organizations are not above the law just because they are religious. There are certain laws that they need to follow that are imposed on all of us for the good of society. Religious organizations cannot engage in acts of violence or terror, certainly. They cannot endanger somebody else's health, safety, and well-being. And we need to get back to an understanding that religious freedom is a principle that protects your right to worship or not as you see fit, but gives you no power to determine what other people do. Secularism, secular, these terms need to be common and embraced by the American people. Right now, they're too often dirty words. They shouldn't be. The secular state is the basis of our freedom. It's what gives us the right to decide which religion, if any, we will adopt. And I would challenge all of you to help your fellow Americans understand that secularism and the secular government are not things to fear, but things to embrace. Now, I want to conclude just by talking a little bit about how we get there, because we're going to need your help. First of all, you need to understand this is a long-term project. I'm not talking about something that's going to happen in a few years. There are people in this room, and perhaps even myself, who will not live long enough to see this come to fruition. But we will lay the groundwork anyway, and we will pass the baton to another generation. Ironically, this is one area where we can take a little bit of inspiration from our opponents. Remember, they spent nearly 50 years trying to overturn legal abortion in this country, and regrettably, they did it. 50 years, though. Do you think you would get a result like that if you just threw up your hands because you didn't get it within 2 or 3 years? No, they're in this for the long haul. We need to be as well. Demographics are on our side. If the country's changing, the idea of a church nation is starting to dwindle and change. I just saw a report today about millions of Americans who had only a tenuous connection to houses of worship stopped going entirely during COVID, and they don't plan to go back. As that demographic trend continues, and as a younger generation comes along that is more willing to stand up for secularism, we need to be working to empower them now. So an understanding that this is a long haul fight, that this is not going to happen overnight, that you need to be working on it constantly, that you need to be speaking out in various forums, that you need to be voting, that you need to be politically active, that you need to be understanding the role that religious freedom and the interpretation thereof play in elections, how that influences people, how that where the candidates stand, especially local candidates and school boards and all these sorts of things, is extremely important. So people ask me sometimes, is there hope? And I can certainly understand why some people think there isn't, because it's a very scary time to be working in this area of separation of church and state. It's a scary time to be advocating for humanism. It's a scary time to be advocating for rational thought and science education. But that's all the more reason to redouble our efforts because of the strength of the opponents right now. We know that if we can make the right arguments, we can defeat them, but we must have our eye on the long game. So when people say to me, what are you going to do? I'll tell you what we're going to do. That wall of separation that Thomas Jefferson spoke of so eloquently in 1802 in his letter to the Danbury Baptist of Connecticut. We're going to rebuild that wall day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year, brick by brick. Let me say that again, just to be clear. Day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year, brick by brick, until again, it is high and firm and strong and protects us all. Thank you.